The C-130, when I flew it, had no computers on board. There was no GPS. So it was a lot of teamwork to fly that airplane in those conditions. Safety is an attitude, and it's a team sport.
Hello, and welcome to Working with me, Dan Doriani, hosting a podcast where we explore faith, work, culture, and the way believers can make a difference in their corner of the world. Here's a question for you. What does a cargo plane have in common with an operating room? You'll find out today in my interview with Lance Acree, an aeronautical engineer and pilot who became a healthcare consultant. This episode is a resource for anyone who works in a team and strives to cultivate collaboration, character, and creative problem solving at work. My guest today is Lance Acree, and he's a highly accomplished man. He is a professional, and he has credentials in both management and engineering, and he also has significant development in the area of policy review and analysis. And then finally, he's got a leadership side to him, and I'm delighted in reading an article he sent to me that you wrote a little while ago, Lance. So just very quickly, Lance, you have degrees in engineering. You have a degree, a bachelor's and master's in engineering mechanical, and then aeronautical. And then you were a pilot, which makes sense for an aeronautical engineer. You flew cargo planes. I'm really interested. You flew C-130 cargo planes in remote parts of Alaska, which means it was really hard, austere conditions, hazardous conditions. And then you were good enough at it that people decided you should train other people, which I think is fantastic. And then you studied engineering management to help people, help you teach people better how to manage the processes you were learning about. And then you moved on to the C-17, which is a truly massive plane that does things like carry tanks from here to there in the air, and has a payload of 172,000 pounds. That's gigantic. And then you went into engineering management. And among other things, I think you helped create a C-17 that has a crew of just 3 people and it's still safe, if I understand correctly. So that's a quick introduction to who you are. You want to comment on any of that? Tell us a little bit more about your life path and how you went from one thing to another.
Well, I never intended to be in the military, and I never intended to be a pilot in the military. So that's one of those stories where man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. I didn't know that I had the eyesight to be a pilot. I didn't know that I had a resistance to air sickness, which turns out to be pretty important for a military pilot. But the Lord worked all that out, and I discovered as I was going along that He's always got something up His sleeve. And so part of this adventure in the work and faith arena is discovering what He wants you to do next. It's a kind of a string of adventures.
Yeah, a lot of people who are 20 years old don't really know what they're good at. And somebody looks at them, I'm guessing maybe somebody recruited you and said, hey, Lance, you would be a good pilot for the military. Did something like that happen where you recruited, a talent scout came by and recognized something in you?
I'd like to tell that story, but that's not what happened.
Okay, that's fine.
What really happened was my father and I were visiting a college. I was a senior in high school, and I knew the family was struggling. I have 4 other siblings. Our family farm was struggling. I was worried about tuition. But when my father went to this school, ROTC was mandatory because it was World War II. And so every male student in his day was either in Army or Navy ROTC. So out of the blue, without ever having used the word before in my entire life, he asked me as we were walking around the campus, which ROTC program I'd like to go visit.
That's hilarious.
And I just blurted out Air Force. And so he said, okay, let's go see the Air Force.
Oh, wow.
So we went and sat and they described their program. And I was just kind of tapping my knees and going, okay, that's interesting. But then they said, and we have scholarships.
Yes.
And at that point, I sat up straight and I said, how do you get one of those? Sign me up.
Yeah. So I got to ask you, I got to get to the business of safety and flying in hazardous conditions. And then apparently you were good enough at it that people said you should be a trainer.
Yeah.
and you were quickly doing that. So
Well,
what's it like to
yeah.
learn how to fly in hazardous settings, and how do you excel so much that people want you to train other people?
That's another thing. I didn't realize how risk tolerant I was. I always thought of myself as a rather, non-courageous kind of a person. But once they put you in the program and they, started training you, and I saw how good the training was. Matter of fact, I kept expecting them to flunk me out, but they kept passing me along, promoting me, and eventually to become an instructor pilot. And then I discovered how much I enjoy teaching.
Yes.
Teaching in the airplane, teaching in the simulators, teaching in the classroom. I just loved every minute of it. I couldn't believe they paid me to teach people how to fly complex airplanes.
So see, this is the sign of calling, that people
Yeah.
say, I can't believe I get paid for this.
Mhm.
So in God's providence, family need and willingness to follow your dad's lead, which of course was a surprise, but we commend your desire to honor your father and go to the ROTC led you to God's path. That's terrific. Can you just tell us what does it mean to learn how to land in austere and hazardous conditions? What is that? Does that mean it's 10 below zero and the wind is blowing sideways?
Lots of that. Low visibility, lots of fog, low quality navigation aids.
Okay.
The C-130, when I flew it, had no computers on board. There was no GPS. We relied on a navigator to help us navigate. So it was a lot of teamwork to fly that airplane in those conditions. It wasn't just, hey, I'm the great pilot flying in austere conditions. It took a team effort, flight engineer, navigator, loadmaster, 2 pilots. Sometimes we're flying above the Arctic Circle. Lots of odd things happen when you're up that far north.
Because it's cold and the air is different.
Yeah, the air is significantly more dense, behaves differently. The airplane behaves differently.
Kind of like you can't hit home run when it's when the air is 27 degrees at the ballpark. Is it that kind of a thing?
It does strange stuff. It really drove home the essential of teamwork to operate in that kind of environment.
So then eventually you became a planner, an engineer you didn't just teach people how to use planes that already existed. You helped design planes and cockpits and make the crews work eventually. Can you just tell me about the mindset of planning and working with test pilots? I had a conversation with another guest on this show who has an engineering side as well, and he goes, we make things and then we push them and probe them until they break. We want to find out how strong they are, and we don't really know how good they are until we break them. But that wasn't a plane, and you can't test a plane till it breaks. That's called a crash, and lives are endangered. How do you test a plane? I mean, according to what I read, you wanted to make the crews smaller but still very safe. How does that work?
Well, it was somewhat controversial at the time because, like I say, we're going from a crew of 5 or 6 and more, sometimes on the bigger aircraft, down to 3. And there was a lot of controversy about whether this was going to be safe or not. But a lot of the things that the crew used to do were now automated. And so it became a shift in skill set. Whereas before, a pilot would flip a switch and then watch on a gauge to see if something happened or not, whether a valve opened or a pump came on. Now, the pilots were pushing buttons, and that was changing the logic in some software somewhere. Of course, the pilots are not trained to be software engineers, but we were now sort of software managers. So we had to understand, how does the airplane think about itself? The test program is designed to explore all the ways that something could go wrong.
Yeah.
And they do it very methodically. I'm not a test pilot, but I did work closely with them on the C-17, helped manage the test plans and so forth. And they try and do it under very controlled conditions.
So we're not risking life, in other words.
Right. We want that airplane to come back in one piece.
Now, I'm going to give you my hardest question, and we don't really know each other, but I'm for you. We have mutual friends. So, I want you to give an answer people will like, but I do want to ask the question. that I ask my other friends who are involved in the military and maybe in designing planes and weapon systems. The basic command that God gives believers is love the Lord your God with heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbors yourself. How can you design weapons systems and love your neighbors yourself simultaneously? Because you've worked on weapons systems, at least not constantly, but at a couple points in your career, you worked on weapons systems that go on planes. And maybe they were defensive to protect a C-17 or C-130, but you did work on weapons. How does that cohere with Christian commitments?
We need to go to the word neighbor. And I think many times the culture sort of abstracts away from your neighbor, because your neighbor is somebody you know, and they're quirky and they have annoying aspects to them. And sometimes you're in the mood to interact with your neighbor and sometimes you're not. The biblical perspective that Christ is commanding there is you don't have a choice. You are acting for him to interact with somebody that you know. Now, when it comes to combat, in many ways, you're talking about people that are not going to be your neighbors. Matter of fact, they are working to kill you, to destroy your livelihood, whatever.
Or attack your people as well.
Or attack
not
your
just
people.
you personally, but
right. So it's a little bit more abstract. And I say a little bit because you also know that there are Christians in those foreign armies, because God is calling people from every tribe to be his, and is equipping them with faith and repentance, just like us. But in the end of the day, we're all seeking the welfare of the city where God has sent us into exile. Seeking the welfare of the city also includes seeking its security, its military security, its chemical, biological security. So I ended up, oddly enough, playing bad guys in war games. That's another thing you may have noticed.
Yes.
To try and make sure that the good guys, quote, our side, was going to understand what could happen and be better prepared for it.
Right. Thank you. I love that answer. So one other person I interviewed said something like this. He said, first of all, he's an American. The weapons are defensive. They're for defense. I understand that defensive weapons have to have offensive capabilities, but we're creating a defense. It's called the Department of Defense, not the Department of Invasion, right?
Right.
So, I mean, the goal, you can always question United States policies here and there, but the goal is defense, not attacking and taking, we've never tried to do a land grab from Canada. I won't get into, maybe we might have done some things we shouldn't have done with Mexico. We won't go down that path right now, but it is defensive, and the goal is to defend really innocent people, like women and children who are living in border territories historically. So that's his answer. Does that sound, that's a believer, a church leader. Does that sound close to what you would say?
Well, yes and no. I think, the best defense is sometimes a good offense. So sometimes we design offensive weapons to deter.
Right.
So that deterrent aspect of an offensive weapon, it's like the racking of a giant shotgun.
Yes.
In the darkness to let the burglar make a good decision.
Yeah, the excellency of the F-15, for example, means that people don't try to shoot them down because they're not going to succeed, and so it actually strength leads to peace in that situation. And I think it's still true that no F-15 has ever been shot down in combat because they're just such good airplanes. But you have had, although you've, your lifelong interest, or maybe not lifelong, but for many years of your life, your interest is safety, making sure people don't die, that planes don't crash. World War II, a lot of people died in planes. And I mean, I looked up the numbers in order to interview, 3,000 people essentially died in B-17s and B-24s. A lot of them were people shooting them down, but there were also a lot of failures, mechanical failures, human errors. Tell us one or two things you do to make sure that pilots and navigators and everybody else are safe. Everybody's safe. What are one or two things you do?
Yeah. So one of the revolutions that I personally lived through as a young officer had to do with the team aspect of safety. I alluded to that earlier in the Arctic environment, but United Airlines back in the 1980s decided that they were having way too many accidents. And of course, it's not good for business. And so they essentially upended a culture in the cockpit, turned it upside down, essentially dethroned the captain and made the captain change the way they behaved so that they would include the rest of the crew as a team. And not many captains were okay with that. It was a hard thing for older captains to adjust to this depowering because they were spreading the power out among the team. And so as a young officer, I got exposed to that. I'd just become an instructor pilot, and I was given the assignment of teaching old and young pilots together how to do this. The ultimate was safety is an attitude, and it's a team sport.
Mm-hmm. I love that.
And that's why I'm still working in the healthcare world. I've been working with anesthesia professors, retina surgeons, various other clinicians to try and bring more of this into their world.
That's terrific. So we're talking about transfer from one field to another,
Mm-hmm.
and the idea that no one person can make all the decisions, discern all the variables, see everything that's going wrong, and you want to empower the people that are around them. Which, of course, you and I are both Presbyterians, I think.
Right.
And so we believe in the plurality of elders, and we believe that the pastor is not the church dictator, that the elders
Mm-hmm.
can say to the pastor, you really shouldn't do that. We're going to give you a different approach. So those are core convictions we have.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about your meditation on how organizations work. So you sent me this very, very interesting article that's full of words that begin with the letter P that is extremely stimulating in my view. And it's we could say in a way that it's about the difference between leadership and management. And
Mm-hmm.
what happens when you lose your purpose and you lose your philosophy, or you don't lose it, but you lose clarity about it and it recedes. And then you start talking about policies and procedures that can be contrary to your purpose and your philosophy. You tell a story there, and I've read about it before. It's maybe a pretty well-known story about Joshua Chamberlain and the days before Gettysburg and the so-called mutineers of Maine's 20th, I think that's right, 20th Army. Can you give us a quick summary of what happened and how that illustrates your point that it's philosophy and purpose first and procedure second?
Well, I was introduced to this story through some Campus Crusade military leadership training that they do on the Gettysburg battlefield, and I'm forever indebted to them because it made me take a close look at Shara's story, The Killer Angels, which is about leadership on both sides. Who were the leaders? How did they lead? Robert E. Lee is famous for saying that my men can do anything if properly led. And so leading properly is why we were there. And we began to study Shara's reconstruction of this historic episode when, somewhere 80 to 100 mutineers from a Maine infantry regiment were dropped in the lap of Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, who's also from Maine, and his 20th Maine regiment, which was sorely depleted of men from seeing combat. And Chamberlain knows that a huge battle is coming up. He doesn't know where or how it's going to start, but he knows he is desperately short of fighting men.
He needs everybody he can get who's got experience.
He needs everybody. And so here's all these men, and they're actually well-trained, seasoned fighters, but they're fighting the Union Army instead of wanting to fight the Confederate Army.
And they're liable to death, technically speaking, for desiring to desert. So it seems.
It's military justice. If
right.
you mutiny, you're deserting, you can be shot.
Right.
That's policy.
That's policy. Yes.
Yeah. So now it's up to Chamberlain to figure out, and I love the way Shara describes it. It really bothers Chamberlain that here's these men, he needs them to fight. And so how does he get them to fight for the right side? Quit fighting him and the Union Army and help fight on the right side. And so he gives a speech, and Shara has to reconstruct this from letters, but it is so interesting to see his reconstruction because it highlights what I call the philosophy level of leadership communication. We're all familiar with purpose statements or mission
Hmm.
statements. Everybody's got those. We're familiar with policy and procedures that are written down. It struck me that the philosophy level is really where leaders make their money, so to speak. That's where leaders stand out. Leadership begins when somebody is speaking at the philosophy level.
In this case, the philosophy is we need to fight for the freedom of the slaves
Right.
and not fight each other.
And not only that, he speaks to identity, which is
Yes.
another profound thing in the scriptures,
Yes.
that God gives us a new identity and it's his to assign to us. It's not something we go out and manufacture on our own. Chamberlain essentially stated this is the identity of the 20th Maine
Hmm.
Regiment. We are men who fight to set other men free.
Right.
And that contrasted with the mutineers, of course, who were saying, look, we want to fight to set ourselves free.
Right.
So there's an ethical dimension there because clearly setting other men free is ethically superior to setting yourself free. It's not as selfish, number one. It's probably going to cost you your life, but it's worth it in the biblical ethical framework. So Chamberlain is pulling, and remember, these were just farmers and
Right.
carpenters, and he is speaking to them as if they need to hear who they are.
Right.
They need to adopt the identity of the 20th Maine and become men who fight to set other men free. He spent some time working through this with them. It just struck me how powerful, and of course it's a powerful story because he actually did convert them from mutineers into fighters,
Right.
and one of them would even earn the Medal of Honor that day.
Wow.
One of the mutineers was awarded the Medal of Honor.
That's outstanding. So I wanted to pick up on this because, of course, it's a great study in what goes on today in so many organizations that the procedure said mutineers should be disciplined and maybe even executed, but the purpose is to win the war. And the
Right.
philosophy is to get people to follow through on their commitments. And as we don't have time to go into it, but there were some irregularities and there's some procedural mistakes about the way people signed up and the way they were being set loose. And so the procedures were causing all the problems and would have led to a terrible outcome. But you had to get back to a higher level that would motivate people, their overall purpose and their philosophy, and as you say correctly, ethics. And I'm just going to say this, it intrigued me because I see this so often in organizations. You know, we're both in the nonprofit world, but in different ways. I mean, I know you do other things for profit, but, you know, the military is not for profit, and I work in churches and schools. And I find that they get lost so often, and they get lost in procedures and policies, and they forget why they exist. So something I do fairly often is talk to churches or schools that maybe don't have enough money for their purposes, and they can get so focused on getting their money that they forget that money is a means to an end, not the end. Or today, you know, we have all these Christian organizations and service organizations that are working so hard on the topic of hero leaders and their toxic side effects. And I'm not defending toxic behavior by dominant leaders for 1 second, but an organization can be so bent on correcting the errors of their leader that they begin to think their mission is to correct the errors of that previous leader and take care of internal wounds and get everything right. And that's great. It's great to get everything right, take care of people. But you can lose your mission, and you can, take care of yourself and your budget so well that you stop paying attention to what you're supposed to do with your life. So, I mean, I view money as a kind of a procedural and policy level issue, not a philosophy purpose level. And ditto with internal relations. You got to treat people well, Christian organizations, absolutely, dignity and so forth. But you can be so intent, you can be so happy about how well you get along that you stop doing the ministry you're supposed to perform. That was kind of a little speech, but your comments really reminded me of that. Am I reading you correctly, or you want to add, subtract, comment?
No, absolutely. I personally have great doubt about the heroic leader model.
Right.
Anybody on the team can begin leading if they recognize hey, we need to rise up above the management and supervisory level here and start talking about, do we have the right philosophy? Are there philosophy level statements that are in conflict? And you saw in my essay, I try and give a simple example of philosophies in conflict. Like, if you don't take care of your customer, somebody else will.
Right.
It's immoral to allow fools to keep their money.
Right.
You can make money both ways.
Right.
But you can't make money both ways at the same time in the
Right.
same organization.
Right.
Because people will not operate that way.
So you have to get, I just want to invite you to say it again. Anybody can lead. I'm sure you don't mean absolutely anybody, but a large number of people can lead. Clearly your whole career is decentralizing leadership, getting all the decisions out of the hands of the pilot, all the decisions out of the hands of the surgeon, et cetera. Rely on your team so anybody can lead. But we have to sort of surpass or supersede the level of management. You said something else. What was your core statement? I thought it was very important.
Well, the management and supervisory levels are necessary for 90 something percent of the time. We're just trying to standardize things, like flying an instrument approach. We want to do it pretty much the same way every time because that's the safest and most efficient way to do it. But sometimes the situation has changed rapidly. Nobody anticipated this particular kind of thing. So someone needs to rise up above the policy and procedure conversation and introduce what is going to govern the policies. And so Delta Airlines is actually the one that published a philosophy statement about the automated cockpits. To their credit, they stepped out above the policy level and provided some real leadership. Well, a loadmaster in the back of the airplane can do that. If he sees the officers up front aren't understanding the situation, he knows or she knows that the situation has changed because it's in his or her area of expertise. But empowering them to speak up and say, I think we better think about this a whole new way, kind of thing. That kind of empowering people to speak up and, hey, give a shot at, we're all scratching our heads. Maybe you've got the way forward and we don't see it.
This podcast is a production of the Center of Faith and Work in partnership with the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. If you're enjoying this conversation, you know the drill. Please rate this podcast and subscribe to it. And visit our workingwithdan.org site to get updates on new episodes, explore old episodes, hear clips from lectures on work, and enter to win our giveaways. Before we jump back in, I want to draw your attention to the topic of character, which we discuss in a moment. So often our work is utilitarian, driven by bottom lines and quotas. But how does our character fit into our understanding and practice of work? And how does the gospel shape our character? Let me ask you one more, and we're going to go to rapid fire questions in a minute.
Sure.
But I want to ask you one more sort of big picture from your experience. So one thing that people talk a lot about today, which we've kind of glancingly touched, is the skills character issue. So on the one hand, we're lamenting, at least in Christian circles, all these highly skilled leaders who've fallen, Ravi Zacharias, Bill Hybels, Mark Driscoll, and others, unfortunately. They're so skilled, so charismatic, so intelligent, such great speakers. They move people, they woo people, but they're lacking, so far as we can tell, gravely lacking even in character traits. And so then we move the other direction and say it's all about character, character, character. And I've given talks that say, with pastors, certainly the main text, 1 Timothy 3, has 11 character traits and 2 skill sets, able to teach and managing. But then the next one in 1 Timothy 4 is about 50-50, skills and character. And I think we still need to say, look, skill sets are important, and skills are what get us started, right? And if you don't have skills, it doesn't matter how wonderful your character is. If you're looking at a certain technical job, that gets you in the door. Then you might wash people out, kind of like you'd wash out a pilot because he can't see well enough, right? Or she can't see well enough. you would say, oh, you have all the skills to be a Christian leader, but oh my goodness, your character. Sorry, you can't be a Christian leader. Give me your take just for a minute or two on that. What would you say? You've been in situations where high skills are needed, no doubt, but you clearly believe in character also.
The first thing that pops into my mind is my favorite analogy for how God builds our characters. It's the Japanese sword. The master takes this, collection of lumps of metal, and with a lot of heat and a lot of beating with sledgehammers, turns it into this amazing sword because the metal, it's not so much the sword itself, but the metal has these qualities that you can only get through this, heat and hammering process. It's an analogy because I think that because we're fundamentally broken, profoundly broken, all the way down, no aspect of our self is untouched by the fall. We all struggle to build and participate in this character building exercise, but a lot of suffering is going to have to be required because, in my estimation,
and that's the beating on the sword part of it,
and the heat.
Yep.
But God is determined that we will have these qualities, and I'm grateful for that. It gives me hope, so that when the hammer blows start, and they will,
yes,
but I know whose hand is on the holding the handle.
Yes.
I know who the craftsman is, and I know his agenda, and it's an awesome agenda. I am just so impressed with how God relentlessly pursues his agenda of building the character of Christ in us. You shall be holy as I am holy, to me is a promise, not just a command. It's a promise. It's an outrageous promise.
Yes, it is. Well, let me say one more thing, and then we'll go to our rapid fire questions. And that is, I appreciate your point on this. And of course, we also agree that no one will ever have sufficient character, no matter how many, in this life, how many hammer blows and how much heat and how much we learn from adversity and how much God knocks the silliness out of us. We're never fully qualified, and that's why we always start with the gospel. That tells us that no matter how sinful we are and unable to reform ourselves, God has loved us in Christ. And, that also applies to matters like career. I interview people who have good careers and interesting careers. Not everybody does. And God loves people who never become test pilots and never become leaders and don't pass, aeronautical and mechanical engineering, and everybody has meaningful work to do. And God loves us exactly as we are, even if we stick with those jobs we had when we were 17, washing dishes and washing floors, which I'm guessing both you and I have done at some point.
Right.
Well, let me go to lightning questions now. Here's the rule. You cannot answer for more than 60 seconds. I've got an invisible buzzer in my hand.
Okay.
So you have to go fast. Number one.
Right.
Now, tell me one thing that makes you, or maybe two, I guess. What makes you still jump out of bed in the morning and say, man, I've got interesting work to do today? What's most fun about your job?
Well, I'll tell you, one of the things that makes me jump out of bed is the work in the church. I'm not a career churchman, but the work of making disciples in the church, teaching people to observe all that he's commanded. And in particular, I like peacemaking.
Okay.
That's something I've focused on.
Yeah.
Peacemaking makes me jump out of bed.
That's great.
And that also doing that in the secular work environment as well.
Disciple making. I like that. That's in both areas. Okay. Every job has its garbage detail. What's the worst part of your job?
It would have to be the paperwork.
Okay. Yeah.
Documenting things is a chore.
It is.
It's definitely a chore.
Yeah. And you have to keep records. There's no doubt. Okay, good. I mean, not good, but it's a good answer. Number 3, what do you do for fun or relaxation?
Well, I read a lot. I like history.
Okay.
I'm probably reading 3 or 4 history books at any given time.
That's great.
I like playing strategy games, real-time strategy games.
Yeah. That kind of fits a military guy, I guess.
It does.
Do you win? Do you crush your adversaries and take over the world pretty often?
Always.
Always. You always take over the world. I won't tell you what game I always play. If I want to play games with my wife, I have to, okay, I'll play a game you can win, and then we'll play a game you can win. sometimes. If you could do anything without any consideration for practical matters, what job would you take for 1 year?
I would like to learn how to make furniture.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
High-end, beautiful wood furniture. That's an art, and it's hard to pick up.
Yes. That's a good answer. Is there a book you like to hand people?
Yes.
What is it?
It was actually just written by a friend of mine, another ruling elder, Mark Good. It's a ministry book that goes hand in glove with peacemaking.
Okay.
The name of the book is Real Talk. The subtitle is Creating Space for Hearts to Change.
Okay.
It is a very practical work. We were after Mark for a long time to write it.
Okay, good. And he finally
He finally
yielded.
did.
So Lance, it's been good to spend this time with you today. I thank you for taking time out of an incredibly strategic, and it seems to me like busy career. I mean, you have a lot of people who want your skill sets. Thanks for giving us of your time and of your wisdom. And I want to also thank you for your service to the military, but also to surgery and to safety. And we're grateful for that. And it's clear that you've thought long and hard about how to put your faith to work. So thank you.
Thank you for your work. I know you put in a lot of work in our Presbyterian system, and it wasn't easy. And I salute you for that. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been good to meet you, Lance. Thanks.
You too.
Thanks again to our guest today, Lance Acree. He exemplifies the disciple with rare and strategic gifts who uses them to please God and love his neighbor. If you're struggling to find the meaning of your work, check out my book, Work That Makes a Difference. We're giving away a few copies today on the website. Find the link to that in today's show notes, or you can visit us at workingwithdan.org. At our website, you can explore archives of old episodes, subscribe to receive updates on new episodes, receive giveaways, and find bonus content. This podcast is a production of the Center for Faith and Work in partnership with the Alliance for Confessing Evangelicals. Please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And one more time, I'm Dan Doriani, reminding you to work hard, make a difference, and from time to time, take a break.